Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at potentially Eduard's biggest release of 2024, that being their 1/48 scale P-51B. So first things first, let's take a look at the cockpit. On screen now you can see me cementing the back of the seat to the back plate, and then the bottom half of the seat can then slot into this indentation below. To finish off the seat's assembly, I can cement these two holding braces on either side of the seat. There aren't very many positive locating points here, so take your time, use some quick setting glue and you'll be a-okay. Turning my attention to the side walls of the P-51B, you can see that it is somewhat modulated in the fact that you have a base sidewall piece and then you have other bits which bolt onto it. Interestingly, they use almost these ejector pin looking locating tabs to cement or get them to lock into place, and it worked very well actually. And with that, I could move on to priming. I know you can see a lot of pieces here which I haven't shown to you yet on screen, and that is because they've come right off the sprue without really any assembly. The P-51B has quite a few of these modulated colours throughout, as in there's a lot of base colours of zinc chromate green, as you can see on screen now, black elements, and it's much easier to leave them off until the very last moment. After everything had received quite a generous coating of Mr. Surfacer 1500 grey in the aerosol format, I sprayed the appropriate parts with zinc chromate interior green by Ammo MIG. This had been diluted 60% to 40% and is being sprayed at around about the 18 psi mark. For a little bit of contrast within the cockpit tub, I did actually spray the sidewalls in this light green khaki colour just to differentiate them from the darker colour behind. I can now use some masking tape and also masking fluid to mask off the appropriate areas which should now be black. This includes of course some of the sidewalls and also the rubber flooring in the cockpit tub. For the sidewalls where it wouldn't really be appropriate to try and mask off the certain aspects, I did in fact just brush paint on Ammo MIG's matte black. After this I came in with a white and started to pick out some of those lovely details which Eduard have moulded. I'd like to say that all of the details are exceptionally crisp, which just means that they are really easy to pick out with your brush. Another note is that Eduard do give you the option to replace quite a few of these sort of panels and control bits and pieces with photo etch alternatives. However, I thought it would just be almost criminal to get rid of all of those lovely details on there, so I thought I'd give a go at brush painting them, and it turned out okay. Once I was sure that there were no more pieces needed to be painted in the cockpit, I could start bringing certain sub-assemblies together. As you can see on screen, I believe I've just fitted the fuel tank to the back of the cockpit, and now on top of this I'm going to be fitting some of the batteries and other components that are in the P-51. It's good to talk about fitment. Fitment on the whole is very good. Only one or two pieces needed to have a small bit of trimming or a bit of filing down, but I think that might be more due to the fact that I've used quite a few layers of paint in here, so that might have off-put the tolerances very slightly. Something that I usually don't talk about on the channel is actually the instructions that come with the kit. However, you know, when in Rome, the instructions for this kit are very good. You know, they're clear, concise, they give you some great colour callouts, and the CAD drawings are very easy to follow. So yeah, they're good. On screen now you can see me fitting the control column, or the joystick, however you want to say it. One thing I would like to say is a couple of these small parts had a tiny bit of flash on them, or they had some seam lines on them, which were a little bit tricky to clean up without breaking the part. I did unfortunately break one part. So yeah, bear that in mind. Just definitely get out a new scalpel blade and just be prepared for this kit, as there's a lot of very small and fine details. And to enhance those details, as you saw, there's also some photo etch seatbelts and other photo etch available. I think I've already said this, but yeah, there is a lot of photo etch available and provided in this kit. Continuing on progress in the cockpit, I'm now bringing the sidewalls and cemented them to either side of the fuselage. The locating pins here are there's only two of them, and it's quite big and it takes a little bit of wiggling around to get in, which is why I'm using ultra glue and not committing to cement straight away. But once they're in, there's a nice satisfying click and you'll definitely know when they're in. To continue the build up of the interior of each of the two fuselage halves, here you could see me fitting the component that will later hold the exhaust stubs, and now I'm just going to do a small bit of painting for the areas which need to be painted. So there you can see me painting up some zinc chromate for the tail wheel assembly, and there's also a metallic silver for the radiator and oil cooler segment of the P-51. I found myself spending quite a bit of time here, as there are about 3 or 4 different sub-assemblies for the oil cooler and radiator, which all have to be at exactly 90 degrees. I was very careful with this, just because if you've got a slight bit of deviation, I think that could cause some mega fit issues on the underside. So be careful, do some dry fitting, and you'll be good. The entirety of the interior components then receive a nice coating of VMS's matte varnish. This was potentially the wrong idea, because it was so matte that for the corresponding oil wash to go on top of it, it was really grippy, and it actually required quite a lot of effort to manipulate and move around on the surface. So if you are potentially following along with this build with your own build, I'd recommend maybe going for either a semi-gloss or a satin varnish, just to make your life a little bit easier here. But the plan was, at this stage, as you can see, is going to be using the diluted version of that Mr. Colour or Mr. Weathering colour, and just putting it into all of the recessed areas around the cockpit, and then trying to diffuse it into the surroundings, creating nice areas of contrast and just a bit of grubby and griminess around the entirety of the fuselage. However, as you saw, it was so grippy, it was quite hard to manipulate, so it had quite sharp edges. So yeah, there you go, you live and you learn. One thing which was quite good in here was using a different colour of the oil colour for different components. So there was quite a few black aspects in here, and the dark brown wouldn't show up on it, so it didn't look very good. So you can use 2 methods. You can either do what I'm doing on screen now, you can use the oil brusher or dry brushing techniques to start highlighting the black, or you could also use a lightened wash, which is what I did on the rubber floor of the P-51. Both methods work, and they actually work very well hand in hand, so yeah, try it out. On screen here is the tail wheel assembly. So something to note about this is the instructions tell you to put the actual tail wheel itself in at this stage of the build. I was worried that I was going to break it off, so I didn't. I strayed a little bit away from the instructions, and if I didn't learn from last video, I shouldn't have done that, because it actually turned out to be incredibly hard to get the tail wheel in at the end of the build, so just follow the instructions. The main cockpit tub can then be cemented to one side of the fuselage halves, and that is your cockpit assembly all finished. Here's some nice glamour shots, we'll call them, just showing all of the lovely details that are on offer in this Eduard kit. Really impressive, didn't take a huge amount of time either, and fitment was great. Moving on, now going to smush the 2 fuselage halves together. It looks like I'm having a little bit of trouble here, but all it does is it's just a little bit of wiggling to try and get things to slot into place. So with the cockpit all done and dusted, I can move on to the next sub-assembly, and that is going to be the wheel bay. It's got quite a complex structure, the old P-51 gear bay, so I was very interested to see how Eduard would go about it. And the way that they do it is they have a base plate, and everything almost builds up off of it. You can see all of these framework pieces that slot into their own guiding rails and have great fitment, and it is very easy to do indeed. It's nice how well it's been broken up as well, purely because that makes painting it much easier. If you're unfamiliar, the P-51 gear bay is made up of 2 main colours, zinc chromate and also a metallic silver aluminium sort of colour. Instead of trying to mask off such a small and quite complex shape, the fact that it's broken down just makes it a lot easier, and also means everything is a bit more precise, giving it a more in-scale look. The general painting process for this was very similar to the cockpit in regard to it was initially given a base of that 1500 Surfacer Grey. Then I used Mr. Colour Silver and dusted that over it. A good thing to note is if you're spraying with silvers, don't go heavy, almost dust it on and very slowly build it up. It will give a much more shiny effect. I then masked off the designated zinc chromate areas, gave the entire thing a satin or semi-gloss varnish, then using that Mr. Colour Ground Brown wash, I then made a bit of grime and just made it look used it. It can then find its new home in the lower portion of the wing, and it slots in there seamlessly. The rest of the wing can then be built up. A couple of clear aspects are cemented into place. This includes the landing light, and just to create a little bit of that metallic effect that is usually present on the interior of landing lights, I'm going to be using this hyperchrome pen from SMS. Hopefully I'm going to be using this a bit more in the future and tell you a little bit more about it. However, it's a really quick and easy way to get a really shiny finish without having to get the airbrush out. You might be wondering, where do I find all of these new and different products to muck around with in almost every video? And the answer to that is Hannants London. Hannants is my local model shop, and it's located just next to the RAF Museum in London. And they're constantly bringing in a new stock and tools, but it's not just any random gumph. Everything in there has been brought in because it has proved to be helpful and improve our models. So if you're in the area and you're looking for an enjoyable morning out, or you just want to come and have a look at some models and find a new project, their details are on screen now, and I hope to see you down there soon. So catching up with the Mustang, the upper halves of the wings were cemented to the lower halves of the wings. It was then attached to the main fuselage halves, and now we are cementing the vertical and horizontal stabilizers in place. All of them have some really nice big locating tabs, which is great for two reasons. Initially, you get a great bonding point, and it means you have a nice strong fit. But then secondly, you actually get the right geometry of all of the parts, and it just means that you don't have any woo and way and funky looking horizontal stabilizers. Looking at the flaps, these are made up of two pieces. Also, Eduard only give you the option in this kit to display them in the extended position, so that is something to note. Maybe think about if you want to do some modifications to make them raised, start thinking about that now. There's some small amounts of photo etch that go onto either side of the flaps, and then also, speaking of photo etch, here is the control panel included in the kit. It does require a small amount of assembly, however it looks pretty darn cool. Is it on the level of 3D printed decals? I'm not too sure. That's maybe something to discuss down below. The control panel can then be cemented or almost wedged in between the two fuselage halves. It is a very tight fit here. I did have to end up doing a small amount of scraping on either side of the instrument panel. However, after about one or two scrapes, it's slotted in there without any issues at all. One of the major highlights of this kit for me was this front canopy piece, and the fact that it isn't just the canopy, it almost extends it out, almost Tamiya-esque. If you've built the F4 Phantom by Tamiya, you'd understand what I'm saying, that they bring it out, and it's an absolutely great design feature. It eliminates any funky geometry that you might have or funky fitment issues at that aspect, so I was over the moon to see something like this. After using the kit supplied masks to mask off the canopy and also do a little bit more masking in some of the wheelbase, that was the general construction of the P-51 all done and dusted. So to give me a little bit more clarity on how much more work I have to do along some of the seams and other aspects of the model, I'm going to be using a Mr. Finisher Surfacer 1500 Grey, no surprises there. On the whole, I did quite well on the first time round, as this is a very well engineered kit. You're not going to have any major fit issues at all. There was just one or two pesky little seams, mainly on the underside, which needed to be sorted out, but after they were done, we can move on to painting. So the first colour that is going to be going down is going to be, in my opinion, the more boring of the two colours, which is the neutral grey underside. To do this, I'm going to be using Mr. Colours C13 Neutral Grey. And what I'm going to be doing with that colour initially, as you can see on screen, I'm going to be concentrating it across the panel lines. So the reason for me doing this is it's just one of the multitude of techniques I'm going to do to try and break up quite a monotone colour and draw your attention to certain details. So giving a little bit more explanation to that, after outlining all of these panels in that neutral grey, when I start to then blend it back in, naturally areas where I've already sprayed a coat of that C13 neutral grey will be then a darker version of that colour on top. Therefore, it will then draw your eyes and your attention to those panel lines, highlighting them and just making that monotone grey look a bit more patchy and a little bit more interesting. So what I'm then going to do is I'm going to make it even more modulated, but this time I'm going to be using that white colour, off-white. You can use any lightened colour as long as you're making a certain different tone of that neutral grey, it will work. I like to use a piece of card to really create a harsh boundary between the underlying base colour and the new lightened version on top. It just helps to give a more contrasty feel, but in this case I thought it was perhaps a little bit too much contrast. So to then dial it back down, I'm going to be using Ocean Grey, and it's just going to be sprayed along the panel lines to then diffuse that light into the dark, and it just balances the entire neutral grey out that little bit more. Really, I was just kind of experimenting here. I was having a little bit of fun, just creating some wacky tones and seeing how I could break up a very, very boring and dull colour. And this is what I came up with. I think it was a great in-between of looking a bit faded, but then also looking still a neutral grey colour. So now that I am appropriately pleased with how the neutral grey was, I could mask it off before then moving on to look at the olive drab. So the first colour that I'm going to be using here is going to be Mr. Colour C518, which is actually, it isn't the right olive drab. There's so many different olive drabs that I can't say that it's a certain olive drab, but it's a dark olive drab pretty much, let's just say that. This is then going to be very, very similar to like the neutral grey. It's sprayed along a lot of the panel lines. On the fuselage of the P-51, there are far more rivets. I'm ignoring them for now. I'm still very much directing all of the paint flow over the panel lines. And now I can come in on top with the final sort of colour that I'll be going for, which is C12, which is the olive drab USAF. It's a lighter olive drab. And as I explained before, it works in a very, very similar way. You have a little bit of contrast now on the panel lines between the inner and the outer panels, because of course it's darker. It works the exact same, but this time just with olive drab. You can see also by my airbrush here how it isn't a very linear sort of painting. There is a bit of patchiness in there and a bit of squiggles, and this just breaks up the paint that little bit more as olive drab fades in such a unique way. I love it. So once again, similar to the underside, I've mixed up a lightened version of the olive drab, but this time I'm not using any masking or any template to then go off of the panel lines. Instead, I'm freehanding and I'm trying to highlight all of the rivets that are on this plane. As you can see, there's quite a few of them, and I'm not trying to be super neat here. Neat is not always the answer to these sort of things. I'm just trying to create tonal variation along them so that your eyes naturally start to see them a bit more, and so that they're not lost against quite a monotone scheme. But of course, if I left them looking like that, it would look absolutely horrendous. So I once again used the olive drab colour to blend them back in, and you know, it works well. You know, it from a distance, you look at the airframe and you see, of course, it's the olive drab and you see the panels, but then when you look at it in different angles and different lights, you'll then start to see some of those lightened rivet lines, and it works very, very well. The one thing I would say, and a criticism of myself, is I blended them in too much. On the end result of this aircraft, it will be quite hard to actually see any of this highlighting along the rivet lines, but hey, you know, it'll be something for next time. So now I'm going to do the inverse again. This time I'm just going to be using pure black. It's very, very heavily diluted. It's about 20% paint to 80% thinner, and that is going to be directed along all of the panel lines to really accentuate them. So the reason that I did this was pretty much it was the failed technique earlier. Well, failed might be a slight exaggeration. However, when I used that darkened olive drab, it wasn't coming through. It wasn't punchy enough, really. It wasn't showing through to that top layer of paint as much as I wanted it to. And in comparison to the neutral grey, it just looked a bit out of place. So using this black to dull everything back down and make it that little bit more contrasty was exactly what I needed to do. So all I'm going to do now is blend all of those black squiggles back into place, otherwise it would look very, very odd. So whilst I'm doing that, I might as well talk about paint ratios, airbrushes, and all of that shebang. So shebang number one is going to be my airbrush. I'm using my 0.2mm Pro Convoy. I absolutely love this airbrush. I've talked about it an awful lot it's my favourite airbrush. There's no other way to say it. When it comes to paint, I'm going to be on the whole thinning about 60-40 for doing actual big base layers, and then when I'm starting to blend those techniques in, I actually go 80-20, so 80% thinner, 20% paint, just to give me a little bit more control over the opacity of each layer. And there you go, that was the olive drab all sorted. I was relatively happy with how it came out. Look, the thing was, and I knew this when I was painting, the neutral grey and the olive drab, they're not the focal point of this scheme. It is going to be that big blue nose and those bloomin' invasion stripes. So it was great to have a bit of a practice over these techniques, but at the end of the day, people are going to be looking at the invasion stripes and the blue nose, not those colours. So everyone has their own little method or their preferred technique for painting invasion stripes, but this is how I personally do mine. So initially I'll be having a look at the paint guide, and I'll put 2 pieces of masking tape at either end of the invasion stripe, so all 5 of them. So once I've blocked off the certain area where all 5 of the invasion stripes are going to be, I'll block that entire part in with black. I always start with black. By the way, the black which I'm using here, that is SMS's black, is great for coverage properties. Once the black is all blocked in, I'm then going to get out my pair of calipers, and this is just going to be used to measure. So of course you can use a ruler, you don't need calipers if you don't have them. Once I have measured how big that block is, I'm then going to divide it by 5, as there's always 5 stripes in the invasion stripes. Whatever that value is, so I think there it was, 50, so it would be 10 centimeters. I would then get a piece of masking tape and I'd cut it to 10 centimeters, and then I'd use that as a template going around all of them. I can then mask off, of course, all of these areas, and then once I've masked them off, making sure that they're quite straight, I'll come in with the calipers again and make sure that they're relatively even, and then I can spray the white, and then we're pretty much all done. Speaking in a less generic term about invasion stripes, more specifically about what I'm doing here, you might see that there are some bubbles in the top half of those invasion stripes. That was not chipping fluid, that was masking fluid, sorry. That was sponge chipped on to the wing to create this almost effect of wear and tear. Invasion stripes were painted on field with quite potentially not the best paint, so it was quite prone to chipping, and that's where the pilots and ground crew would be walking quite a bit, so I thought I'd just do a bit of weathering and chip simulation. I can then do even more masking. Yeah, I was well and truly over masking by the end of this, and I masked off the blue nose. This was quite an easy place to mask, to be honest, because it follows some panel lines, and just using some flexible masking tape, and it was all well and good. It was initially based in white, as I thought that olive drab might upset the blue if I wasn't careful, so I'd rather play it safe than sorry than find out later. And then the blue that I'm going to be using is XF8 flat blue, and I think this is a really good match to what is seen on quite a few of the P-51s. It's a nice bright vibrant blue. As you can see, I initially just give it a flat coat. I don't do any special techniques at first, but then once I have that flat base to work off of, I'll do almost the exact same techniques which I did on the olive drab and the neutral grey. So I'll highlight the rivets which are there, but then I'll also use a darkened version and go over some of the panel lines to create some nice contrast. And I was making the most of the fact that I had all that masking tape there, as I masked off the canopy and sprayed it in Mr. Colour C8, which I believe is silver. I'm then going to be using the super metallic aluminium to do some small chips along certain parts of the nose, as after looking at some reference images, this seems to be a place where there's quite a few chips on the P-51. And that was the painting all wrapped up. So to prepare for decals, I'm going to be giving the entirety of the model a nice gloss coat, and then I can move on to applying the decals. I didn't do much filming of this because, it's applying decals. The one thing I would say is I did not remove the film on these Eduard decals. I know I might get a little bit of stick for that, but I was just really pleased with how they went down with the Caro film on. I didn't want to risk peeling them up and then ruining all of my hard work, especially as I'd spent all of that time masking off the blue, and there's no spare decals here, so if it goes wrong, it's going wrong. So after leaving the decals to cure for about a day, I was very pleased with how they conformed into the details. You know, they performed really well actually. I could then give the entirety of the model another gloss coat in preparation for those 2 panel washes. They were applied over the entire aircraft and just accentuated the panels and made it look really good. The model can then get a satin coat, and that is just going to give a little bit more grip to the surface for this stage here. This is more of the accumulated grime stage, we'll call it, and I'm going to be using Starship Filth Oil Brusher to create this grime. So what I initially do is I'm using a clean brush here, and I'm just very gently putting a really thin layer along one edge of a panel. After that, I'm going to be coming in with a flat-headed brush, which is dampened in a little bit of white spirit or odorless thinner, and I'm just going to start stippling that oil brusher out. Oil brushes dry really quickly, so you don't have to wait that long for them to set on the surface before you can start playing with them and start manipulating them. I wasn't doing anything too special here. I was literally just starting or attempting to stipple that oil brusher away from the panel line, so it slowly gets less and less concentrated. And this was the sort of effect that it gave. I think it was quite a nice effect. I think it tied in the rest of the aircraft quite nicely, and it made those pristine invasion stripes look a little bit more grimy and look like it'd been at war. What do you think though? Whilst I'm leaving the aircraft to dry a little bit and let all that oil completely cure, I'm going to do a couple more sub-assemblies. Here you can see the landing gear. The landing gear, or the actual landing gear tyres, are made out of 4 parts, so you have 2 parts for each tyre and then 2 hub parts, and they slot really nicely. Of course you have to use a razor saw to rescribe the diamond cut pattern, but that really isn't the end of the world. It's also good to say that the landing gear legs themselves are quite nice and thick, so they're very sturdy. Although the P-51 isn't the biggest model and it isn't the heaviest, it's still nice to have a bit of security. After the prop had been put together, I can now turn my attention more or less back to the actual aircraft itself and start putting a couple of these sub-assemblies on the aircraft. Here are the exhaust stubs going into place. You have to push them in a little bit more than I did on video here. I was just a little bit worried and I didn't want to break them, so they do push in the entire way. Here are the flaps getting cemented on. Do be aware that these do require a little bit of pressure to get into place, so don't be scared, do give them a bit of a push. I'm sure they'll be absolutely fine. Here are the landing legs getting put into place. I can't get them on or in place on video because I'm looking through a screen, but they do slot into place very nicely, and now that it's on its own legs, I can give it a final coat of satin. Now that the satin is done and I'm not going to be doing any more spraying on this aircraft, I can remove the masks. They performed absolutely flawlessly and left me with really clean edges between all of my canopy framing. And now we really are onto the final stages of this build, and that includes, as you can see on screen, getting the canopy in the open position and also cementing the propeller in place. And that just about wraps this build up, so thank you very much for watching. I do hope that you've enjoyed it and learned a little bit more about this kit if you're going to take it on yourself. And without any further ado, enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time guys. Bye bye.